All right, so today we're really going to dive into some murky waters, with all this talk about attempts to overturn the 2020 U.S. presidential election.
Yeah, definitely a lot to unpack there.
We're talking court filings, AI investigations, the whole nine yards. You've given us a lot to work with here, a real treasure trove of information.
And these sources are really fascinating. They don't just skim the surface, they go deep into how different groups and strategies all kind of converged during this, well, let's face it, incredibly pivotal time in American history.
Right, absolutely. So maybe we can start with someone whose name might not ring a bell right away, but he's a pretty central figure in all this, Jeffrey Clark.
Okay, I've heard the name, but refresh my memory.
So he started as an environmental lawyer, believe it or not, and then he ends up a major player in Trump's inner circle. Like he becomes the assistant attorney general.
Wow, quite the jump. And what's the significance there?
Well, what's really interesting is that he's a member of the Federalist Society, that group known for a pretty conservative legal stance.
Right, I'm familiar.
So when you look at his alleged actions, it's like, hold on a minute, how did we get here?
You're saying there's a disconnect between his background and what he's accused of doing?
Exactly. I mean, the sources really point to a potential shift, right? Like he goes from this conservative legal background to something way more extreme. And to really grasp how extreme, you got to look at the accusations against him. He's accused of pressuring the Justice Department, basically trying to get them to back Trump's claims of election fraud.
And is there any evidence to support these claims?
Well, that's the thing. One of the sources is this draft letter he wrote to officials in Georgia. And it basically urges them to challenge the election results. Thankfully, his superiors stepped in, and that letter never saw the light of day.
Oh, wow. Can you imagine the chaos if that letter had actually made it to Georgia? Talk about adding fuel to the fire.
Right. It could have been a disaster, honestly. And the Georgia letter wasn't even the only questionable thing he was pushing. Clark was also spreading some pretty out there theories about election fraud.
Like what? Give me an example.
Remember that whole thing about the Dominion voting machine supposedly being connected to China through a smart thermostat?
Wait, seriously, that sounds like something out of a, I don't know, a bad spy movie.
I know, right? It sounds almost comical, but it shows just how far they were willing to go to cast doubt on the election.
It's scary to think people actually believe that.
And here's where it gets really unsettling. Apparently, Trump was considering appointing Clark as acting attorney general.
Whoa, are you serious?
Yeah, that's what the sources suggest. And apparently, this move would likely cause a mass exodus from the Justice Department, like resignations left and right. A total constitutional crisis in the making.
Why makes you wonder what was going through their head?
I know, right? What were they thinking? But, Clark was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. And this is where our second source comes in. It dives into these recently unsealed court filings that, get this, thanks to some really advanced AI, have revealed a whole network of people who were involved in these attempts to overturn the election.
Okay, now we're getting into some real deep dive territory. Unsealed court filings, AI investigations. This is intriguing stuff.
Right. It's like something out of a movie. So these documents, they were heavily redacted, like blacked out text, the whole bit. But researchers were able to use AI to basically reverse engineer the redaction and figure out what names were hidden.
Hold on, back up. How do you even use AI to uncover redacted information? That sounds incredibly complex.
That's pretty wild, honestly.
Yeah.
So basically, the AI looks for patterns in the document, like the font, the spacing, even how the text is lined up around the redacted parts. And by comparing these patterns to examples of unredacted text, the AI can, a lot of times, figure out what's missing with crazy accuracy.
That's incredible. So it's like the AI is piecing together a puzzle, using the information that's still visible to fill in the gaps.
Exactly. And the crazy thing is this wasn't some top secret government operation. This was everyday people on Twitter, like DC Dude and Bruchek. They put all this information together and then shared it publicly.
Wow, talk about the power of the people. That's amazing that they were able to accomplish something like this. It really shows how technology can be a tool for transparency and accountability.
It really does. So who were these mystery figures that the AI helped uncover? Well, some of the names weren't too surprising. Familiar faces like Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Sidney Powell.
Right, those names were all over the news back then.
Yeah, exactly. But seeing their names in these documents really confirms that they were deeply involved in trying to challenge the election results.
So they weren't just figureheads, they were actively involved in the strategy.
Exactly. They were in the trenches, so to speak. There were also some lesser-known figures who seem to have played a big role. One that sticks out is a lawyer named Ken Chesebro, known for his work on conservative causes.
So we're talking about a whole network of people all working towards the same goal. To really understand what they were planning, we need to look at the actual legal strategies they were using.
And that's where our next source comes in. We have the actual court filings from special counsel Jack Smith's investigation. This isn't someone's interpretation or a news summary. These are the arguments being presented in a court of law.
Oh, wow. So this is the real deal.
Exactly. And what's crucial here is that these filings don't just say what Trump did, they get into his head, his motivations. The prosecution argues that Trump wasn't acting as the president of the United States, but as a candidate desperate to stay in power, even if it meant undermining democracy.
That's a bold claim. Are they saying he was putting his own interests above those of the country?
Essentially, yes. And they back this up by pointing out something quite telling. Trump never actually reached out to election officials to verify any of the fraud claims he was making publicly.
So it's like the truth didn't even matter to him. It was all about creating a narrative, a justification for overturning the election, whether there was any evidence or not.
That's what it looks like. It's like he was manufacturing a crisis to justify his actions.
And it's not like he was just, subtly suggesting things. It was this constant drumbeat of misinformation. And Trump himself, he kept amplifying it, which just created this environment where people were primed to distrust the results. And eventually, that distrust boiled over into action.
Yeah, and that brings us to January 6th. The filings draw a very clear line, right? They connect Trump's rhetoric, especially all those claims about a stolen election, directly to the attack on the Capitol.
It's frightening how quickly words can turn into violence like that.
Absolutely. Especially when they're coming from someone in a position of authority.
And what's even more concerning is that the filings say Trump still blames Mike Pence for the violence that day. Like, he refuses to accept any responsibility for his role in inciting it.
It's like a broken record with him. He just deflects blame at every turn. But, blame aside, it sounds like his legal team is planning to argue that he had presidential immunity.
That'll be interesting to see how that plays out in court. I mean, inciting an insurrection, that's not exactly in the job description for the president, is it?
Yeah, presidential duties, give me a break. It just seems like a very weak defense, especially given the seriousness of the allegations.
Right. It's not very convincing.
But we have to remember, at this point, these are still just allegations. Trump is innocent until proven guilty.
Absolutely. That's a crucial point. But still, when you look at all the sources together, the connections they make, the arguments being made in court, it's definitely concerning, to say the least.
No doubt about it. There's a lot to unpack here. We've got Jeffrey Clark, AI uncovering conspiracies, legal battles playing out in real time. It's like we've stumbled into some kind of political thriller.
It really does feel like a movie, but with much higher stakes. And the thing is, it's not over yet. This case could completely change how we think about presidential power, how we use technology in investigations, and honestly, the future of our democracy.
It's a huge responsibility for any court.
Yeah.
But even with all the information we have, there's still this big mystery, right? And it goes back to those AI investigators. Remember how they were able to identify most of the names that were blacked out in those court filings?
Yeah, you said they were only able to figure out most of them.
Well, there's one name they haven't been able to crack. Co-conspirator, #4.
Oh, wow. That's really intriguing. It's like a cliffhanger in a movie. You're left wondering, who is this person? What's their story?
Exactly. And I think it really highlights the main point here. This is about the power of information, right? The tools we have to uncover it, the lengths people will go to keep things hidden. It's like we've uncovered this huge conspiracy, right?
Right.
But there's this one character, this mysterious figure, and we still don't know what their role was, what motivated them.
Yeah, it definitely highlights how much we don't know. Like, who is co-conspirator, #4? What would we find out if we knew their identity? It could change everything we think we understand about this whole thing, or maybe just adds another layer to an already complex story.
It's kind of unsettling, you know? But it also makes you want to dig deeper, ask more questions, look for answers in new places. And I think that's what makes this whole deep dive so interesting. It's not just about the facts themselves, it's about how we uncover them, that there's always more to learn.
I totally agree. It's about embracing the unknown, acknowledging that there will always be things we don't know, loose ends. Even with all the tools and technology we have, there will always be those missing pieces of the puzzle. So where do we go from here?
Right, that's the big question, isn't it? What can we, as citizens, take away from all of this? What are we supposed to do with all this information?
Well, I think the biggest thing is to really think critically and be skeptical. We live in a world where information is everywhere, but that doesn't mean it's always true or accurate. We can't just believe everything we read or hear. We have to question our assumptions, look for evidence, and be wary of things that seem too simple or too good to be true.
Especially when what we're reading or hearing is designed to divide us and sow distrust.
Exactly. And that's why these kinds of deep dives are so important. By creating a space for these kinds of conversations, by going into the details and considering different viewpoints, we can learn how to navigate this complex world and have productive conversations about the challenges facing our democracy.
Because if we understand how these events happened, if we know who the players are and what they were thinking, then maybe, just maybe, we can prevent something like this from happening again.
I completely agree. It's not just about looking back, it's about looking ahead. What can we learn from this? What can we do to protect our elections and make sure our democracy is strong enough to withstand this kind of attack in the future?
Those are questions we should all be asking ourselves. Safeguarding our democracy is a responsibility we all share, and it starts with being informed, engaged, and most importantly, curious.
Because as we've seen today, the truth is rarely simple, but it's always worth searching for.
So keep asking those tough questions, keep looking for answers, and keep having these critical conversations. It's what keeps our democracy alive and well. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time. Remember to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the Daniel David Allen YouTube channel where RoboCast is posted every weekday. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.